Hi, welcome. I'm James Cooper, the Director of the Program in Economics and Privacy and a professor at George Mason's Antonin Scalia Law School. Here we want to continue our series of discussions with leading scholars in the field of privacy and economics. And with us today, we have Garrett Johnson, who's an assistant professor at the Questrom School of Business at Boston University. Garrett is one of the leading experts in digital advertising markets and has done a lot of recent cutting-edge empirical work surrounding the GDPR, which we'll learn a lot about in a second. So welcome, Garrett. It's great to have you.
Thanks, James. Appreciate it.
Yeah, not a problem. So Garrett, let the two papers talk about today are two working papers out with co-authors. One is regulating privacy online, an economic evaluation of the GDPR. And the second is privacy and market concentration, intended and unintended consequences of the GDPR. And again, both of these works are with co-authors Scott Schreiber and Samuel Goldberg, who I know you've worked with before as well. I want to give them credit, but we're lucky to have you here to talk about this work. So I know that this is a big ask, but briefly, can you talk a little bit about the GDPR? You know, what it is and why it is. It's actually kind of a neat natural experiment that I know you and other economists have used to look at the impact of how privacy regulations may impact certain economic outcomes. So could you just give us a little bit of background on this, Garrett?
Sounds good. Well, first of all, thanks again for having me. Thank you to the PEP program for helping to fund some of this research and also providing feedback as we were developing the research. So yeah, the GDPR is a lot. It's a landmark privacy regulation that I think really set the agenda for what privacy regulation is continuing to look like worldwide moving forwards. And at the heart of the GDPR is defining personal data very broadly to be all data relating to a person. And so it's not just your name or your social security number. It's going to be, a cookie ID or your IP address, for instance. The GDPR gives EU residents several new data rights, like the right to access and to delete their data. The GDPR imposes many responsibilities on firms and sets down conditions for when they can use a consumer's personal data. So this law was enforced in May 2018, and like you mentioned, this is what we're going to leverage to study the effects of the GDPR. It made a really big splash in the news, and I think a big reason for that is that the GDPR fines are quite high. They can reach up to 4% of a firm's global revenue. And so that really captured the attention, not just of European firms, but of firms and people, citizens worldwide.
Thanks, Garrett. Again, I know we could go spend an entire semester probably on the GDPR, but that was a really parsimonious and informative summary to kind of help tee up your work. So first, I want to focus on your regulating privacy online paper. Now, one of the things your paper looks at both what you call recorded outcomes and real economic outcomes. Could you just briefly kind of explain the difference between the two? Because I think it's kind of a clever and interesting way you've broken them out, and something that sometimes gets lost, maybe perhaps going to the heart of some of the stuff that GDPR does.
Yeah, so just kind of high level, and then I'll set the stage for the paper. So one of the high level problems with the GDPR is that if you want to do research on the GDPR, researchers use data to try to get insights. And the GDPR can have a direct impact by reducing the amount of data available to researchers to analyze a policy. And so that's kind of that's the monkey wrench in our paper is the GDPR's direct effect on data. So to set the stage here, a lot of websites use analytic services to understand how consumers are using their website and to generate ideas for improving their website. So a website could hire a service like Adobe Analytics that will allow them to track the amount of site traffic by by country and over time and across devices, and to look at it for different parts of their website. So this is really rich data, and my co-author Sam, who's the lead author of this paper, went to work at Adobe in the summer of 2018. And Adobe really graciously allowed us to look at this data for about 1,000 firms. And this gave us an incredible opportunity to study the impact of the GDPR at scale. Of course, the challenge or the difficulty is that this GDPR introduced a consent requirement for websites that said, websites need to ask consumers before they share this data with analytics partners like Adobe. And so the big problem in our research, or the big puzzle in our research, is, does Adobe record less web traffic after the GDPR because some people don't consent to data sharing, or is it because the GDPR is actually hurting these websites?
So I guess then I mean, again, I think it's kind of interesting. Maybe something gets lost. So the GDPR is about retarding data flows in some ways, and if you're a researcher, that you may not capture that because of the GDPR. So how did you get then at I guess kind of two questions. One, I think you've already sort of come close to answering, but the mechanism through which the GDPR would impact, you've explained how it would certainly impact recorded outcomes, how it might impact real outcomes. And then how did you go about trying to measure real outcomes as opposed to kind of separate out the two, which again is, I think, one of the more clever parts of your paper?
Thanks. So yeah, as you said, like one of the reasons why we might see less data on the Adobe side is that is consent. So if users don't provide consent, then Adobe doesn't see this data anymore. But in terms of the real effect, the real potential harms to websites, I mean, one channel for this is via marketing. So the GDPR, by restricting personal data, makes it harder for firms to use personalized marketing channels like online display advertising or email to reach consumers and encourage consumers to visit their website. There's other explanations that are possible, and certainly one thing that we were concerned about is that one of the consequences of the GDPR is that there's these privacy pop-ups everywhere, so that may dissuade some users from continuing to browse websites. But at least in 2018, we didn't really find evidence for that last explanation. So we're kind of focusing on the consent versus marketing effects. Now, your second question, I think, was like, how did we try to analyze the effect of the GDPR here?
The real, how did you tease out the two and kind of get to, I think the interesting part for policymakers is what's the real economic consequences here?
Yeah, for sure. So it's kind of a two-step process. So the first step of the process is to try to understand just what was the effect on the Adobe Analytics data. And so in order to do that, we compare the amount of recorded traffic data that we see before and after the GDPR, and then we further compare with the control group. And so our preferred control group is to use the same websites from the previous year, because obviously there's no GDPR effect there. And then what we're assuming is that the demand for these websites in 2018 would follow the same seasonal trends in 2017. And so, the answer to that first step is that it seems that recorded page views and recorded e-commerce revenue falls by about 12% for EU users after the GDPR. But then we have this big question, which is this just consent, or is this a real effect of the GDPR? Now, my answer is that, frankly, this is a very, very, very hard question, and we're never going to really know the answer with confidence. And so we take a different approach, which is we try to construct bounds. So we try to say, it's at least this big or at least this small under what we think is weak assumptions. So when we do that, we arrive at estimates that the non-consent rate is between 4 and 13% for websites. This aligns with industry figures that suggest that over 90% of users were providing consent. And then, what's the harm then? Well, in principle, the harm could be anything between 0 and, whatever isn't explained by consent. But one of the things we noticed in the data is that the data is actually kind of cool because we can actually see if a user is arriving directly at the website or if they're clicking on an ad to arrive at the website. And what we noticed is that there was larger drops for users that were arriving via an email click or a display ad click. And so these are personalized marketing channels that are targeted by the GDPR. And so, we use this to estimate a conservative lower bound on the GDPR's real effect. And so this evidence pointed to is that the GDPR hurt EU website traffic and e-commerce revenue by something like at least 0.5%. And again, that's being conservative. So I think, going back to your question, what's the takeaway for policymakers? If you're concerned about real harms, as trying to come up with that number as conservatively as possible, that's 0.5%.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I think is interesting in your paper as well. If I recall correctly, there's a correlation between page views and revenue. Is that right? Because with sort of the idea that the more page views you have, at least from a publisher standpoint, there's going to be more impressions. So could you just talk a little bit more about that mechanism, and then maybe we'll move on to your other paper, which sounds a little more in competition.
Yeah. So websites make money in two ways. Basically, they either sell you things directly, and then they're an e-commerce website, or they use advertising to generate revenue. And so, if we find that there's at least a 0.5% reduction in the number of page views on a website, then that should be reducing the amount of advertising revenue by something like 0.5% as well. And for e-commerce websites, the nice thing about partnering with Adobe is that we get to directly observe the e-commerce revenue data that's at least making its way to Adobe. And so there we can actually say, that is, clearly a real revenue effect. So, I think this paper is interesting because there's kind of something for everybody here. If you're a GDPR supporter, you might say we're really happy to see that there's progress in reducing data collection. You'd probably say that this didn't go far enough because these high consent rates probably mean that GDPR's high bar for consent wasn't being followed. You might be happy that the harms appear to be low. But if you're a GDPR critic, you'd say, well, there does seem to be a real harm to these sites. The minimum estimates are small, but that's also being very conservative. You'd say reduction to data collection is not a victimless crime either. That's something that hurts the abilities for websites to improve and to improve their marketing to consumers. And one last thing I'll say about this paper is that we noticed that the consent rates appeared to be higher, at least according to our model estimates, for large sites than they were for small sites. So this is, another potentially anti-competitive effect of the law. It's going to be harder for smaller websites that are less known to consumers to collect data about consumers.
Well, thanks. And I think that makes a great segue to talk about the second paper here in our queue, your paper about privacy and market concentration, the unintended consequences of the GDPR. So can you, again, nice segue, because I know a lot of scholars and policymakers have talked about the potential impact of certain privacy regulations on competition, and this paper is great because it's empirical and it tries to get directly at that question. So can you talk a little bit about the hypothesis here, how GDPR is it, the impacts from GDPR and how you're using this as an experiment to measure something?
Yeah, so as you said, there's been concern about privacy regulation being anti-competitive. I think in general with regulation, there's a concern that it can be anti-competitive because, if firms that are larger have more resources to comply with the law, they could be advantaged. So that's kind of a general concern. When it comes to privacy specifically, one of the issues is that when privacy regulation uses consent, it may be easier for larger firms to obtain consent or to obtain consent for sharing data with a shorter list of firms. So as you say, there's been several people that have, worried about this impact. Now, that's not necessarily a reason to avoid all regulation or avoid privacy regulation. But this is something that there wasn't really any evidence to suggest this. And we wanted to use the GDPR as one of kind of the largest privacy regulations we've seen to actually study this.
So could you, kind of then walk us through a little bit of the data and methodology that you used to explore this question?
For sure. So the GDPR is really hard to study because we typically don't observe how firms handle or share personal data. So in order to get around this problem, we study the website industry and the vendors that websites use to do various things. So this includes like selling advertising and hosting elements on the website, like their fonts or their videos, and using, site services like Adobe Analytics to measure site analytics. So in order to make websites work, websites tell your browser to interact with these other websites that are owned by these vendors in order to load the information that these vendors need. And this provides an opportunity for research because we can use specialized software to identify the vendors each website is loading when you're visiting a website.
Okay. So then what are your major findings here? What do you find that concentration increases, decreases, and then I guess kind of the second question here is what are your what if any implications are there for policymakers here?
All right, so starting with the first question, we find that sites do reduce their use of these vendors by about 15% 1 week after the GDPR. And if you look at the data, it's the vendor use is basically like falls off of a cliff, or at least a small cliff after the GDPR. And at the same time, we find that the market concentration rises 17% 1 week after the GDPR. So, if you're not familiar with thinking about concentration, is basically what we're saying is that the pie shrinks after the GDPR. And we want to ask, do the large vendors get a larger share of the smaller pie? And that is, in fact, what appears to be happening. The concentration is increasing 17% because it seems to be, and I think that's kind of the contribution to this paper, is that there's one thing we hadn't really thought about when we were thinking about the anti-competitive effects of regulation is that if you have regulation that pressures firms to share their data with fewer vendors, then they're probably going to prefer to keep the large vendors, because the large vendors, they're large because they're good, or they're large because they're more able to comply with the law. So that's kind of the big takeaway. Now, one challenge with this paper, or one kind of wrinkle with this, is that the vendor use actually bounces back to pre-GDPR levels within a few months. And this is a real puzzle. I don't think we know why exactly this is, but the regulators themselves have repeatedly criticized this industry for not being compliant, but they didn't issue fines for more than 2 years. So I think part of what's going on here is that websites are adjusting their compliance strategies because they see that regulators weren't taking a hard line.
Interesting. So perhaps if you got the data and at some point in the future went back and revisited, maybe you'd see as the uncertainty surrounding how GDPR could be enforced, as you talked about before, the fines could be, in theory, can be enormous. Almost kind of a bet your business kind of size for some of these, especially for smaller publishers. So maybe if there's more clarity, and then we may see a new equilibrium. But it's quite an interesting finding. That, and again, one of these sort of, a lot of people have been talking about how privacy regulation in particular can have negative impacts on competition. I think that certainly interesting. Well, so thanks a lot, Garrett, for that. So overall, given your findings, what sort of advice would you give to policymakers who are thinking about a GDPR style regulation? I mean, we see a lot of this going on in the United States now. A couple bills are percolating on Capitol Hill the FTC has issued a proposed rulemaking or an advance notice of proposed rulemaking around online privacy. So what's your advice, Garrett?
So I have two big thoughts for this. So the first big thought is pick your battles. So privacy regulation is hard for firms because they incur significant costs to comply with the regulation. And one of the things that our research and other people's research has shown is that this can hurt the revenue too. What's more, we've got these GDPR papers like ours suggesting that smaller firms are especially hurt by this regulation. So given these unintended consequences, regulators should think carefully about what types of data and what types of industries pose the greatest privacy risk in order to better target regulation. The second big thought that I would have is that regulators need to recognize the benefits of the data economy. So, we started this off saying that GDPR fines are high, but I think you just made the point not too long ago that like in some industries, the benefits of personal data plausibly well exceed these fines. And so in these cases, we expect firms, everybody wants to comply with laws. So they're going to try to take compliance steps, but they're probably not going to set their businesses on fire to comply with the law. And so, this is how we end up in the current status quo on the internet where no one is happy. Users hate browsing the web and seeing these consent pop-ups everywhere as they go. Websites hate bugging users and they hate getting squeezed by this regulation. And then, privacy groups aren't happy and regulators aren't happy because haven't made as much progress as they would have liked in protecting people's online privacy. And so, and how do we get to this mess and stay in this mess? Well, I think a big part of it is that these regulators also lack the democratic mandate to squeeze these websites so hard that it would wreak havoc on their business model. So, how do we get here? I think, again, going back to that message is we need to recognize the benefits of the data economy and think about how we fashion regulation around that.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot, Garrett. I hope somebody, policymakers are listening. That's very, in my view, very sound advice. So again, I do want to thank you. My guest today has been Garrett Johnson from the Questrom School of Business at Boston University. His papers will be linked with this video. So again, Garrett, thank you for taking part in this pep talk.
Thanks for having me.